Welcome to our third night of our Wednesday More Than mini-series. We want you to know that it doesn't matter what night you are watching all of these, but we hope that you are watching, and we hope that the discussion material that's been provided is beneficial for your discussions at home and is helping you think further about what we're speaking on each time. Tonight, we are going to talk about the fact that the church is more than a Sunday service. And this probably represents one of the biggest things that we feel has been taken away from us by this whole pandemic, and that is our ability to worship God all together in a large gathering at our Sunday worship service. Now, of course, we could all decide to meet together, but out of love and safety for one another and out of love and safety of our neighbors in the community, our elders have come together and have come to the conclusion that we will abide by the CDC recommendations and we will suspend our gatherings for the time being. And I hope that this is producing in you a stronger desire to meet together whenever all of this is over.
We said something similar to this last week, but in most places in the United States, if you were to tell someone, I'm going to church, most likely they would assume that what you're saying is that you're about to go to a church service on a Sunday. And rightly so. We want to make clear at the beginning of this that we are in no way suggesting that assembling with other Christians to worship God is anything less than biblical. But on the other side to that is that for many in our Christian culture, even Christian people, the Sunday church service is about as far as they think when it comes to church in their minds. If you were to comb through your New Testament tonight, you would not find anything written as plainly as Christians are commanded to gather together on Sunday. And that's because the New Testament doesn't read like an encyclopedic rule book, although sometimes we do wish that way. Instead, we read in passages like Acts chapter 20, verses 7 through 12, 1 Corinthians 11:17 through chapter 14, verse 40, and then also 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. Also 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 through 15, and Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 through 25. In those, we do read that there was a designated regular day of gathering that turned out to be the first day of the week, which is what we today call Sunday. The first day of the week, however, in the ancient world was not a day off of work like we expect it to be in our culture. You see, what made the first day of the week significant for the early church was not that it was the most convenient day of the week to meet, but it was actually significant primarily because it was tied to the resurrection day of Jesus. Jesus was crucified on the Friday before Passover, and he spent Sabbath day on that weekend within the tomb and was raised again to new life on the first day of the week, which was the day after Sabbath day. And the first day of the week is when we see the New Testament church begin, when the Holy Spirit was poured out on all flesh in Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 41. Also in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, we see John make reference to the Lord's Day, which going forward into later church history, we find out that it became the most common title associated with the first day of the week. It's a wonderful thing that Christians and non-Christians in our country alike recognize Sunday as the day in which the church gathers together to worship God. It's a good thing because it's a testimony to the incredible far-reaching power of the supremacy of the resurrection of Jesus.
However, sometimes this near nationwide and possibly even worldwide recognition that the Christian church gathers on Sunday, we have often communicated the importance of Sunday for the church almost to the exclusion of the other 6 days of the week. The church has been so impactful on this matter that in areas of our country, specifically where Christianity is more of a cultural given, there exists a deeply ingrained mindset that as long as you are regularly in attendance at church on Sunday, that it almost doesn't really matter what the rest of your week looks like. If you've ever driven up I-65 and you've made it past Prattville, Alabama, then you've probably seen the sign that reads, "Go to church or the devil will get you." And it's got a nice little picture there of what some would say that the devil looks like. And while we might understand the sentiment of that sign, we have to ask what exactly it communicates to those driving by and those who see it, or even someone who has been taught that church attendance is the scorecard for Christian living. As long as you are sitting inside of a church building on a Sunday, then you're safe, right? It's representative of the problem that we're kind of speaking to tonight. If we think of the church as only the service that we attend on a Sunday, well, then we are missing out on the fullness of what God has in store for His church. I want you to recognize something. Just a minute ago, we listed every place in the New Testament that deals with gathering on the first day of the week, and we hope that we didn't miss anything. The reality is, when the church is supposed to meet is addressed a relatively small amount of times in the New Testament. That is not to say that Christians meeting on the first day of the week is not important, because it absolutely is. But in a Christianized culture where believers and non-believers alike tend to think that Sunday gatherings, that is the only context of the Christian faith, this fact begs the question: if the Sunday gathering is represented only a handful of times, then what is the rest of the New Testament really about? And what is the business of the church beyond our Sunday gathering? And what have we been robbing ourselves of by viewing the church life as only having to do with Sundays and maybe even some Wednesdays?
In order to understand a more whole life view of the Christian life, we have to first understand the big overarching purposes of the Sunday gathering, the Sunday church service. In 1 Corinthians chapters 11 all the way through chapter 14, the Apostle Paul writes to the church that's there in Corinth in order to mainly correct them on several different subjects that have to do with the life of the church. All of the correction that Paul provides for the church here has whole life implications for every Christian within the church. But most of the correction that Paul provides there in that section centers on issues regarding the assembly of the Christians together. We see as we read the primary purpose for their meeting together was the vertical relationship between Christians and God in worship. But right underneath that primary purpose that we see in those chapters is the implicit fact that the worship of God does not happen in a vacuum, but instead it happens within the community of believers together. Paul's critique to the Corinthian church isn't actually that they were worshiping God wrongly necessarily. His critique was rather that they are mistreating and discouraging one another while they are worshiping God. And as a result of that, their worship to God was tainted by the way that they had misused their horizontal relationships with each other during this worship time. The overall idea of these 4 chapters is that when the church gathers together weekly, it is to worship God together so that the church is encouraged and built up. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25, I'll read that for us here. Hebrews 10, 24 and 25 reads this: "And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." Many of us are familiar with the passage because of the instruction for Christians to meet together and to not neglect not meeting together as a habit. But unfortunately, some have simply just stopped there. But if we read verse 24 and the end of verse 25 all as a whole, we see that the purpose for meeting together is not just because I said so. Yes, we worship our God together, and God's immeasurable greatness demands worship from His people. But what we miss out on if we neglect meeting together for the weekly meeting time with Christians is that we miss out on the opportunity to stir one another up for love and good works in verse 24, and we miss out on the opportunity to encourage one another in verse 25.
Well, let's think about it this way. In terms of sports, the Sunday service is really a lot like a huddle in a football game. If you're on offense, the huddle is pretty important at times. It's where the game plan is discussed and where the decisions are made about what is going to play out on the field. It's where the playbook is reviewed and consulted as to what we're going to do next. It's where players are told their role and what comes after the huddle. And when the huddle is broken, the players head out to the field, take their positions, and execute the play. But I want you to imagine that in the fall, when Lord willing sports comes back and we're all sitting watching football and we're watching our favorite team and they are entering the huddle, all right? They're talking about what they're going to do next. They're breaking down the game plan. And then the quarterback breaks the huddle. They all shout, and they walk back to the bench. And they do that, and they sit there for another few moments until it's time for them to go back and do it all over again. You'd be frustrated. Some of you would probably even be standing and shouting at your TV screen, "You're supposed to play the game." But this is how we treat our Sunday service sometimes. It's a huddle of sorts where we celebrate the small victories, we talk about the game plan, and we assign the roles that we're all meant to play. But when we shout break, we walk it back to the bench and we sit out until it's time to get back into the huddle again. What we read in the New Testament about the all-encompassing 24/7 Christian life is all but shouting at us, Sunday-only Christians, you're supposed to play the game. While the early church definitely did view the first day of the week as very significant, they didn't make a sharp distinction between what their lives were supposed to look like on Sunday versus the other 6 days. In our modern world, we tend to front load the entirety of the Christian life into those few Sunday meeting hours and give off the impression that if we give God His time on Sunday, well, then we can have our time until the next Sunday. The most notable example of how pervasive of how pervasive church was to the early Christians is found in Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2 starting in verse 42, and I'll read that for you. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing proceeds to all, as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. In the beginning, the church had a relative amount of peace in their existence. As the church moves along, they begin to run into persecution. And in Acts 5, we read that the apostles are arrested and put on kind of a mini trial in front of the Jewish council. In the end, they are released from their momentary imprisonment. But look at this in the end of Acts chapter 5. We'll read verses 40 through 42. And when they had called in the apostles, they beat them and charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus, and let them go. Then they left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. And verse 42 reads, And every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching that the Christ is Jesus. On the heels of being beaten for sharing their faith in Jesus, what did they do? Under threat of violence, they continued every day going to the temple and house to house teaching about Jesus. They didn't wait until next Sunday to do the work of Christ. They saw every day as a valuable time to live their Christian lives among their communities.
You know, we have so much time on our hands when we think about it. Yes, we do lead busy lives, and some of us have more time now that we're in this pandemic situation, and unfortunately some of us now have less time to deal with. There are 168 hours in a 7-day week. Of those 168 hours, 56 of those hours will be spent sleeping if you get a good 8 hours every night. I don't usually get that, but that's the average, supposedly. That leaves 112 hours, waking hours, for the week. When the world is not dealing with a global pandemic, the typical work schedule is an 8-hour day, 5 days a week, for a total of 40 hours in a week. That even before the pandemic, typical work schedule has become more and more undefined. But in that typical idea of the week, that leaves 72 free hours. Also, when we're not in a global pandemic, we typically gather as the church for roughly 2 hours on a Sunday morning, 1 hour on a Sunday night, and we'll round it up to 2 hours usually on Wednesday nights. That's 6 hours, which leaves us with 67 hours for the rest of the week. Using the huddle analogy that Casey spoke a few minutes ago, that's 6 hours spent in the huddle. And a game is played after that huddle, not just with those 67 hours of free time, but in all of the time outside of the huddle itself, whether you're at work or at school or working from home or whatever you might be doing. I think Paul has a lot of great things to say to us during this pandemic time, him being someone who faced imprisonment and being in one place for a long amount of time inconveniently, not being able to move around. In Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 through 16, remember, Ephesians is one of the letters that Paul wrote while he was in prison. In chapter 5, verses 15 through 16, he writes this: "Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil." We are the church 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because we are the blood-bought people of God. And yes, we gather on Sunday and we praise his name and we discuss the game plan and we assign roles. But if we're going to be the church of the New Testament, we're going to have to start playing the game every day. We have to carefully consider, as Paul says, how we walk or how we live our lives day to day, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. That means that there is always an opportunity in every day to use that day for good or for evil, to use that day for God or for sin or for things that are idle. For each and every one of you at home watching this message, we hope that as this video wraps up, that you'll look through the discussion material that we're and that you'll discuss all the things that we talked about in our message, the church today, whether we can all move about freely as we all hope we can someday soon. And as always, we love you and we miss you, and we'll see you soon.